Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with best-selling author and editor Kris Kennedy. Kris, welcome to the summit.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here.
So I know you're an extremely experienced author. You've got almost 10 books out there. You've had a lot of success selling them. And something that we're going to dig into today is this concept of turning point. So I'd love, before we dive into the nitty gritty of the presentation, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what turning points are and maybe when they came on your radar as a writer.
Yeah. Well, I really, it's funny when I think of how little I knew when I started writing. So turning points sort of hit me, after a couple books where as a structural thing, as something to pay attention to. What I was aware of was if the end of the scene didn't raise a new question, people got bored. Like that's what my critique partners at the time would tell me, like, I'm not sure. And what I started realizing was the end of the scene has to raise some kind of question or make something seem more difficult. And over time, I came to learn that means it turns, something has to turn. But I've developed my sensibilities about them now. I have a much clearer understanding, and they're incredibly powerful to shape and fuel story. They help so much to, even if you're not a plotter, if you write kind of more by the seat of your pants, having just these touch points to be thinking about throughout the story at the large scale and on a scene level helps so much. Maybe not always in the first writing, but when you go back to edit and you're like, what's working, what's not, having these, even if you're not a big analytical kind of writer, these can help so much.
That's how I always like to contextualize all of this writer's craft
Mhm.
tools, templates, ideas, all the things we're talking about in this summit. I'm like, okay, you're a writer and you have a toolbox and you fill it with turning points and with story structure and with character arcs and all this stuff. But then you put it aside. You
Mhm.
go, you do your thing, you tell your story, and then when
Mhm.
something's not working, when you're running into a problem, when you don't know where to go next, you go over to your toolbox, you pull out that concept, you can overlay it, and you kind of go, oh, this scene
Yeah.
doesn't turn. That's
Yeah.
what's going on. And I think sometimes people get overwhelmed where they're like, how do I keep track of all these things at
Yeah.
once while I'm drafting?
Especially when you're just starting, when you're, or you're, we reach these peak moments where these plateaus where we've gotten to a certain skill level and we're feeling confident. And then you go up and suddenly you're like, oh no, I still have so much more to learn. It can be overwhelming.
Well, I think that's a mindset you have to get into early on is you're never going to learn it all, right? I think there's a quote from Hemingway where he says, we're all apprentices in a craft where no one ever becomes a master, right?
Yes, yes, with our lives and with, because it is, I think of it as a craft. I think of us as craftsmen, craftswomen, craftspeople. And I love thinking of it that way. It feels good. It feels right for what we're doing. Yeah.
Well, I know you have an amazing presentation plan, so why don't we pull up those slides and we can
Okay,
really
cool.
dig in
Yeah,
here and have a
absolutely.
great exploration of this concept turning points.
Oh, I almost brought up my email for you guys, so that would be fun. Whoops, I did bring something up. I told Kevin, guys, that I'm gonna shut off my video while I'm talking because otherwise all I do is stare at myself, and that gets me distracting. So there I go. Um, so yeah, is there anything in particular that you would like to have me talk about, Kevin, or address, or just like dive in and start talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, let's walk through your slides
Okay,
here,
cool.
and I'm eager to learn. Like we just said, we're all lifelong learners, so I can't wait
Yeah,
to hear what you have to share here, and I'll
cool.
certainly ask questions as we
Cool.
go.
Yeah, yeah. Dive in anytime, and I can pull this off or put me up. So the key about turning points is that they truly turn the story. Like if they would literally turn the story if the story was a physical object. I think of our story as like a pool ball rolling on a table, and the turning points, they bump it. They move it in a different direction. or they change the velocity of the story. In other words, basically how fast it's moving, how fast events are happening, and how quickly the character is responding. And when I say they change the trajectory, I mean the direction that the story or the character is going in plot. So something new comes up, and a new clue or a new stake or a new character, a secondary character, and now there's a new goal, something new to take care of. But the key thing is they change and they turn the character. They're like a pivot point. They're like hinges on the door, and the way these turning points turn the character is it changes their underlying beliefs or their what they want, and then in response to that they change their actions. And so I think that's where sometimes turning points can feel I don't know, structural, and maybe they don't touch the heart of what your story is really about. But I think of them as they are. Their purpose is to transform the character. We think of turning points in terms of plot and ask, okay, what should happen here, or what's the worst thing that could happen here? But I think we need to get underneath that and ask, why is it the worst thing for the character? What is that turning point event, that story event? What's it going to change in how the character thinks or feels? And then what are they going to do different as a result? I think if we focus on the character, it gives a lot more story fuel, because really, in my opinion, that is the point of turning points. It's to change the character. So there's also one of the easiest ways, I think, to think about turning points is, in addition to changing, the trajectory of the story, there's always some kind of value change from before that moment and the character's reaction, and then, their behavioral response, and after. And by value changes, I mean, there was something that felt, you can think of it as simply as positive to negative or negative to positive. But it's negative or positive in terms of the story goal. Is the character, and therefore the reader, feeling like, yeah, he's gonna get what he wants right here in this scene. This is gonna go, oh no, that didn't work out. Or vice versa. They go in entirely, thinking this is never gonna work out, and it works out, or it works out better than they ever could have dreamed. And that's sort of the another way, because value changes don't just have to be negative to positive, positive to negative. They can intensify that. So it can go from good to great or bad to terrible. It just needs to change. If the plot is really just a vehicle for that kind of change, it's like the cocoon for our butterfly protagonist. Those turning point, the plot that they sit in is really just for them to change. And the longer you have a character stand still emotionally or in their behavior or just their emotions, the more flat your story is. The more they do the same type of thing over and over again without changing, the more likely readers are to set your book down. And turning points are important in when they change the trajectory, or they change the velocity, or they change the value. Things are better or worse in terms of how hopeful we are about the story goal. That the turning points are building tension, and like I said, they're calibrating hope. The reader, or the character, and then the reader are more or less in doubt about whether they're going to get their goal, whether they're going to accomplish their goal. And that can be like a scene goal, or it can be the big story goal. But every turning point does those things. It calibrates how hopeful we are, or it makes us more tense that it's not going to happen. There's the big story turns, the inciting incident, the first main turning point, midpoint, and that kind of all is lost black moment at the end. And I'll talk about all those. But also every scene has to turn. Basically, something has to be different at the end of the scene than at the beginning. Specifically, something about how tense or hopeful we are about the character's success, or else why have the scene? If nothing has changed, the scene probably shouldn't be in there, and that's nice too for editing, because you can drop some unnecessary stuff. Um, in romance in particular, since that's what I write, romance writers are juggling some additional turning points, because they actually have it harder than other genres. Uh, a lot of people think of romance as pretty simplistic and pretty formulaic. No more so than a haiku or a sonnet, right? These are formulas, uh, but they work. They have emotional power. But romance is heavily reliant on tropes, and I think that's what a lot of people think of when they think of formulaic. But romance writers, if you guys are writing romance, you have that plot to track, and it's going to want turning points. You have your character arc to track, and that is what your turning points are really aimed at. But romance writers, they also have to be managing the romance conflict, the romance storyline, and they're actually juggling two character arcs. So have fun in there because we have a lot to do. So yeah, anything there that you wanted to talk more about or whatever?
Yeah, well, I think this is a really great overview of turning points and how important they are. I love your terminology here of inject tension and calibrate hope. I've never heard it used with that terminology, and I think that's great.
Good.
One of the ways I kind of think of the value of these shifts is coming from like a musical background. I like heavy music, but there's this point with heavy metal where it becomes so heavy that there's no valance to it, so it's just
Yeah.
and you lose the emotional rhythm of having high points and low points. And so I think of that musicality when I think of something like injecting tension and
Mhm.
building tension, but then also releasing tension and
Yeah.
calibrating hope and bringing some
Yeah.
hope in the story. Is we want loud moments and we want quiet moments,
Yeah.
because it's that balance shift that
Mhm.
actually brings the highs feel higher, the lows feel lower when they're compared to one another. Whereas if you didn't have these turning points in your scenes and in these big moments in your stories, it would just feel all the same, the way, a very heavy metal song might just feel all the same throughout without those loud moments mixed with quiet moments, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. It's a really great analogy. It's one of the things my poor husband, whenever we're watching a movie, I'm talking about that. I don't know if you saw the Hobbit movies when they came out,
Absolutely.
that travesty. I don't know if it was a travesty or not, or any of the folks here. But the aside from the destruction of the beautiful, simple story, they it was a monotone of action. It never changed. And it was exactly what you said. You never got to appreciate the hard punches of action or energy or tension, because it was always there. They never weren't running from someone or arguing, or it was, yeah. You're exactly right. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So it's funny. I just I put my daughter to bed right before we started recording, and I'm in the middle of reading her The Hobbit. So The Hobbit is very
Oh,
much on my mind, and I think I can, having just put down the book, um, what you're talking about there is one of the reasons that book is such a classic, is
yes.
because there is quieter moments and more fun action moments. And I mean, so all the best stories have that mixture. They have the comedy, but they have the drama. They have the love and the emotion, and they have the more visceral whatever, right? And
Yes. Yes.
obviously, the Hobbit book is a masterful interweaving of all those things.
Yes.
And you could probably think about every time Gandalf leaves and every time he comes back,
Right.
we have major turning
Exactly.
points, right?
Exactly. And they did, Tolkien did just a masterful job with that super simple arc. Is so powerful because of where Bilbo started. And then to picture, which is one of the things I was going to talk about in crafting this, is to think about what your character is going to do at the end, what they're going to need to do, or after you wrote it, what they are doing. And then you want to walk your character back as far as you can to at the beginning of the story, so that they're so different that that thing they're going to have to do, it's unimaginable. And in The Hobbit, the book, it was great. It was perfect. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So let's talk about the inciting incident. I'm gonna turn me off for a second. Um, this is what I think of as the story launch. It's at about 10%. You can go longer. This isn't a rule, but the idea is readers are going to be wanting something. They want to know what to follow, and they definitely are going to want it to know it about here. And it's the catalyst. It introduces that main conflict, and it gives the character their goal. It needs to be triggered by something in the external world, like in The Hobbit. Gandalf showing up was the inciting incident. You could say The Hobbit showing up was the inciting incident, because Bilbo didn't quite realize he was being incited there, but it was only a couple sentences later. So, and the character in response has to take some kind of action, because that inciting incident upset the balance of their world. However, precarious, or how much they didn't like the balance of the world, as much as it, was the, Save the Cat talks about stasis equals death. The idea that at this point, early in the story, at the beginning of the story, that you need to show somehow that the character cannot go on this way and, be happy or continue. But we do a lot of things we probably shouldn't do. And characters often at the beginning of stories are trying to maintain a life that is not the best life for them. But they don't make change until the inciting incident happens. But it can be a positive thing. It could be like a new job that you've been wanting. Or it could be, a bunch of dwarves showing up at your door. It can go either way. And this, I have two special tips around this, and one of them relates exactly to what we were just talking about, is to make sure there's a reason the character was living the way they were living 5 minutes before the story opened. And that means backstory. You don't have to dig in too deep, although I adore backstory. I think it's story fuel. But what you do want in some way is that the character has a real reason that they were doing the thing, that they were pursuing the new job, that they were living the way they were living, a reason that the external launch is such an impact on them. You want it to... You can think of it as a theme. This is what you're setting up at the beginning is kind of their fatal flaw, or the missing piece, their blind spot. It's the reason stasis equals death. And it is the theme. Like in a movie, this is often a little more clear than in a book. It's the thing that, like, one character says to another, like, dude, what are you going to take over every competitor and then what, to, a CEO, or, to the sort of shy and retiring characters, someone might say, oh, you're never going to amount to anything, are you? It's those kinds of things. In movies, those thematic statements are framed really clearly for us. Sometimes in a book, it's a little more difficult, or more muddy. But this is what you want. You want, by the inciting incident, or at it, but by it, you want them to have a reason to be living the way they are, and or pursuing or avoiding pursuing the thing they're pursuing. And it has to be something they're committed to, even though it's like kind of their flaw or their blind spot, or the missing piece. They need to be committed to that thing and to doing it that way. It's part of who they are. And it's important that they are like Bilbo wasn't just like chilling in his hobbit hole. He loved his hobbit hole. He didn't want adventure, and he didn't want it in a big way. It meant something to him, and that makes all the things you're going to do later, and especially what happens at the end, much more powerful. Like we were saying, if you picture that action that they're going to have to do at the end, you want to set them back in this first 10%, and at the inciting incident so far that you could not imagine them doing what they're going to have to do at the end. The more you set that the character at the opposite end of that continuum, the more powerful it's going to be. So I think that's important. And for folks writing romance, there's other things you have to do here. This is the thing. This inciting incident is what gets the leads together, and it shows how wrong they are for each other. They're just constantly in conflict. They hate each other. But you also need to show how right they are. It's often just a hint, just a little touch. But I think that is where sometimes romances can fall down on an arc level, because they argue, and then at the end things are good, happily ever after, and that you can't do that and have a powerful story. And you start it here at the inciting incident when you show that there's something that they're each other's missing piece, that they're actually also right for each other. So that's a little thing for romance writers. So yeah. Anything?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, I love what you say here about this inciting incident area is where you can start to establish your theme, because how I always like to think of it is, what is your controlling idea? What is your message? What is it you have to say about the world with this story? And so, the author I'm working with will say, love conquers all is what I really have to say. Okay, great. Now we have our ending polarity, which means, this whole book is going to be about the turning point that gets us there, which means in this beginning portion leading into this inciting incident, our character believes that love does not conquer all. And so I think that's a great way when you pull theme in here. That's what we're talking about. Stories are about people or the world changing. And so when you know what you have to say, the truth of your messaging, all you need to do is weave that into the opposite, into your character's life at the beginning, and then send them on that journey of change.
Yeah, and I think sometimes theme feels sort of esoteric and just sort of meta, and not why most people are writing. But it is the arc, and it's not complicated. It's the thing the person couldn't imagine doing because of their beliefs or because of their sort of frozen emotions at the beginning, and it's that lesson learned. Yeah, and it's powerful. It can power story once you nail it. I never nail it except in a very generic kind of romance way, like happily ever after, but I rarely nail it on the first time, and then it's a revision process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let's talk about the first turning point. I'm not that a lot of times you'll hear structure about sort of the second and third turning point, but to keep it simple, and I have to, because otherwise I will make it very complicated. I just do. When I think about story, I just think about the first turning point and midpoint and black moment. All is lost kind of thing. So this first turning point is something happening, again, an external event happening in the story, or the character learning something that has been in place. It can also be stakes rising. In other words, other people being affected that they weren't aware about before. And the character has to take some kind of new or decisive action. This is where, like, a reluctant hero will start to take action, but they're still very reluctant. You can have a reluctant hero up till midpoint, or heroine, or whatever You can have someone be reluctant, but they need to take some kind of action here that's a change, and them doing that demonstrates to the reader that change has begun, that they're on their arc, that they're starting to arc. It has to be something different. And as soon as they make that choice, they enter the new world. It, you know, doesn't have to be Wizard of Oz new world, but it's Bilbo running out of the house and going after the dwarves. And he was not even quite sure why he did that, but we know why. Because he was an adventurer, and he was bold, and he did have that in him. So sometimes we know more than the characters. But it's super important to have the reason they take action here. Again, go back, it relates back to their own beliefs and emotions, and there's some kind of small tweak, something changes for them. And that is how we know they're in the new world. And you know, I mean, it works in every genre, in every kind of story. Bilbo runs after the dwarves. The village learns of an impending attack, and the heroine decides she's going to use a bow and arrow. She's going to learn. She's going to fight too. In you know, a science fiction, the protagonist agrees to go on the mission. In a romantic comedy, they decide, okay, we're going to go on the road trip. The protagonist takes a new job. I mean, it could be anything, but once they make that choice, they're in the new world. And while they're there, these are all the things that happen. They face circumstances that they haven't before. They feel emotions that they've been warding off. They're in situations that they're not equipped to handle. And this can be a little confusing because, you know, you might have a seemingly quite competent protagonist. But the things in this new world are going to test them. So they might be really competent at what they do in business, or, you know, like a strong warrior or something, or, you know, it could even be, it's been a long time since I read, but the Jason Bourne books, you know, he's kind of back in his element when he's in the new world, but where you tap into the circumstances that they're not equipped to handle, there's always some kind of emotion that they don't want to be feeling, maybe multiple ones. Romances are great for this. So you can have the super commanding hero, but when he's with the heroine, she's pushing his buttons, in a way no one else does. He's feeling affection, which he hasn't wanted to feel, and feeling, you know, protective, feeling. So the way to tap into why is the new world new? It's not just that they're climbing cliffs and jumping out of, you know, planes. It's that they're feeling things that they don't want to be feeling, and they don't know how to handle. And they sort of, I don't know that I mentioned that before. I might have forgotten to, but the idea of backstory, there's a shard of glass. Something has happened in the past, or some things that have sort of frozen the character where they are in that place emotionally. And from their backstory, they've developed some really core beliefs about themselves in the world. You know, people can't be trusted. You know, only the strong survive. You know, those theme kinds of statements. Adventure is bad. I don't think Bilbo had a shard of glass, but he didn't need one. But basically the backstory is how you get them to be ill-equipped to handle the new world. And in a romance, this is where this is usually the first time one of the main characters makes a pro-romance choice. They choose the romance or the other character in some way. It doesn't have to be let's get married, but it might be, okay, I'll ditch this meeting because you need me to give you a ride somewhere. Like things like that. It can be the smallest thing, depending on your story scope, but it's a new behavior. that they wouldn't have done before. So we know they're changing. And once they make it, they're in a new world and experiencing emotions and situations that they don't want or are ill-equipped to handle.
I love that you're bringing the romance angle into this because I write thrillers and horror. And so my turning points are normally going the exact opposite. It's like when things are
Yeah.
starting to get good for your characters, I'm like, okay, let's start ripping things apart here. Like, let's start killing people off. And it's just a great example of how, you know, the decisions we make as storytellers are genre dependent. It's like you were talking about earlier, the tropes that are out there.
Yeah.
Genre is an agreement with your reader that you're going to deliver certain things to them. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, the turning points that the way you use turning points can change depending on the type of story that you're telling.
But you're exactly right, because this is where in a horror genre where they'll enter, you know, they are faced with the other, have been, and now they make the choice to try to do something about it. And this is in whatever genre. You're exactly right. It's the I don't know if this is PG or not. The things get tough, and it's in whatever your genre says they need to happen. They get tough for the character, but they're so much fun for us. It's like the whole reason we picked up the book is from this moment on. You know, it's like we want the horror, we want the monster, we want the, you know, we want the romance, we want the mystery, we want the clues to start dropping. We, you know, what in the thriller, this is when the protagonist starts figuring something out and starts tracking things down. And yeah, this is when we deliver the goods as soon as they enter that new world.
Great.
Cool. Okay, so then Midpoint. This is a super duper important point. This is, you know, compared to what they did at the 25% point, that first turning point, this is when they take an even bigger action. What they did at 25% is important, and it moved the story, but sometimes there's still like a way out. Once they make a choice at Midpoint, there is no going back. They do something that they wouldn't have before, and it's an action. They can't just think it or feel it. They have to do something, and it's public. In other words, others can see it. In a romance, it could just be the other lead, but, you know, in a bigger story with bigger, you know, scale and secondary characters, it's literally public. Other people have to see it because it's irrevocable. What they do here is the no turning back point. It's they might recommit to the original goal at a more intense level, maybe, you know, because more intensity is now required. The stakes are higher. They've learned something that has made them realize this matters even more than it used to. Or sometimes people get a new story goal. You know, they realize they were wrong, or something about how they understood the situation was wrong, and they need to do something different. But again, the key is that something has changed inside them now. That's the story fuel. They're changing something fundamentally, and it's something about those core beliefs or those frozen emotions. They've learned something. They understand something that they didn't before. Like I said, the stakes might raise enough that now they realize other people matter in a way they didn't to the character before. And that means they've arced. They know what they're doing now in a way that they didn't before. These can be like a positive moment, like, yay, this is a great thing, or it can be negative. They could have had a real setback, and something happened that didn't work out like they planned. Part of their story goal, you know, they were trucking along and they got slapped down, but it always fuels insight and drive. They get more determined after this, and like I said, it demonstrates their inner change. But one of the things I love most about this is that the character thinks they're done. They think, okay, I get it now. I need to, whatever. I need to, the, pursue this clue in a mystery. I need to track this person down in a thriller. I need to gather this team or these weapons to fight the monster. I need to say I'm sorry to the hero, whatever. They think they're done, and they're not. You're going to show them that they still have a long way to go. In romance too, again, this is generally a pro-romance kind of act. Sometimes it's a choice away from the romance, which starts the shredding of the romance. But so it can also be pro-romance, so it can go either way. Sometimes in romance it's that sort of I can have my cake and eat it too, like, well, I can pursue the external story goal and maintain have this romance relationship. But the key there is they're realizing the romance is important enough to sacrifice something for. They're willing to take a risk. This is the moment when I had said it's irrevocable, when they take this new action, and it's a public action, that the antagonistic forces in some way escalate after this and totally destroy what they thought they were going to accomplish. It could be it's all related to how big your story scope is, but this can be done really small. It could be a protagonist sitting at a table at a gathering in a romance, and everyone thinks she's nuts to be with this guy, and she gets up and goes out on the dance floor with him anyhow, for instance. They don't have to be huge things in the world, but for the character, they're huge. It's something they wouldn't have done before, and other people see it. And the antagonistic forces increase after this because of the choice. I'm sorry,
I always think of this midpoint shift. I think about the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy, up until for the first 25% of the story, arriving in Oz, she's reacting to things. She's reacting to this new world. She's just kind of, the people say, follow the yellow brick road. And so she does. At our midpoint here, she turns from just reactionary to active because the wizard says, you need to go get the witch's broom. And so now she becomes this active character who chooses to go after the broom. And of course, it ups the ante of the antagonistic forces, because now, rather than just hiding from the witch, she's actually going to the witch.
Yes. And she, the thing that motivated her to do this thing she wouldn't have done at the beginning, is because the stakes have been raised. There's other people at risk and she has to save them. So her motivation just gets this huge like kick in the pants. And yeah, and you're right. This is where characters move from reacting to acting to taking on the fight on their own. Yeah. And those antagonistic forces aren't always they're not intentional, or they're not even necessarily malicious. A concerned family can wreck a romance with the best of intentions. A snowstorm, your characters are all stuck in a hut, and the snow has moved in, and it's going to get worse, and they have so they decide they're going to go out, and they're going to this is the moment where they're like, we can make this happen. They're all excited, they're gearing up, they're like, we can do this, yeah. But it's the moment they step out, it's public, and the snow, the storm is the antagonistic force. Yeah. But they're very active. Yeah. So now comes the fun moment, that sort of all is lost failure of whatever goal they got at midpoint. They failed, as far as I know, and often the failure is even bigger. And it's as a result of what they did or didn't do, or their sort of old world personality, those core beliefs and emotions, that shard of glass. It's the thing they haven't yet learned that they need to do to succeed. Like in The Wizard of Oz, as you were talking about, Dorothy needs to go head on with she she doesn't understand it's not just that sort of face-to-face battle, the grabbing the getting the broom and heading back. She There's something else that's required of her, and she doesn't know that. And so everything that they thought they wanted, all the goals that they had set, everything they thought they understood or knew, everyone they could rely on is gone. And this is when those internal stakes and the external stakes like hit the crisis point. Everyone who could be affected is or is about to be, and all their worst fears are coming true. This often tracks back to the beginning, the fears and the sort of frozen emotions that they started the story with. It kind of seems like they were right at the beginning. That's often what happens here, where they were like, I knew it. I knew I didn't have what it takes. I knew, you can't trust anyone. I knew, like, those old lessons kind of get re-agitated here. Only it's worse now because there's more people at risk, and they're gonna lose what they thought they were gonna get. Um, After this, moment of kind of losing everything is when they have their sort of dark night of the soul, and that this is when they finally understand whatever they didn't before. They face a truth that they need to, or they experience an emotion, they gain an insight, they finally understand. They've been so beaten down, they've been stripped away, they don't have anything but now the truth. They understand things, and this is where that kind of theme that you put at the beginning sort of gets reposed, only now the character has to answer. So it's that, what are you going to do, to take over every company in the world, and then what? Or, oh, you'll never amount to anything, will you? Well, will you? This is when they have to dig really deep and basically answer the theme question. And
I call this the sad music montage. It's that moment in every movie 3/4 of the way through where there's a montage, sad music plays, and your character eats ice cream and cries and looks out a window and it's raining, or they got the thing that they were after and it turns out it wasn't what they wanted. It's the sad music montage moment.
Yes, yes, that's exactly what it is. It's really helpful to think about it in terms of movie terms, partly because we're more likely to have all read the same movie, but they're so stripped down and focused on the arc, that it's easy to point out this moment, that moment. Yeah. And so really that is, in a way, I mean, that's the last turning point. The whole of Act 3 isn't really a turning point, but I did want to kind of just talk about now what. This is where the character is acting out the theme. They're answering that question. They're gathering their resource, because what they've done after that all is lost moment in the dark night of their soul is they've made a choice. They're who am I going to be in this moment, and they decide and they move to make that happen. They take the fight to the enemy, to metaphorically or actually, and they gather whatever resources they need to do it. It could be snow gear or it could be allies, or it could be information, but now they have that sort of key of what to do, of how to be successful. And this is in Act 3 is often where there are hidden strengths. I think of it as like that ugly duckling kind of thing. The thing that everyone thought was your weakness turns out to really be a strength and benefit you. And unforeseen allies can come into play here. Again, because of who the person is, their personality or attitudes and acts that they've done, that ugly duckling stuff can actually start paying off here. And sometimes the things that they've learned actually allow them to be different in the world, and it can have them go out and gather allies or gain information. They now are so committed and they have knowledge that they didn't before, that they can be successful in, gathering the team or gathering the resources that they need to be successful. And this is where they take the action that you could not have imagined that particular person taking at the beginning. That the commitment that they made after the Black moment, this is where they do it. And a lot of times it's a sacrifice at some level. They have to give up something that still matters. A lot of times we'll strip down characters, and sometimes they realize that is the act 3 realization is, that doesn't matter anymore. But a lot of times it still does matter, and if it's their life that they're sacrificing, that's going to matter. So the idea of sacrifice really comes into play here. The idea being it's worth it. It's this thing that I'm pursuing, and the reasons I'm pursuing it, the stakes, are worth it for me to sacrifice something that matters, or at least be willing to. They might not actually lose it. So yeah.
Great. So maybe we can bring
let me get rid of that.
and we'll do a little wrap up here.
Cool.
I have loved this presentation, Kris, because one, I'm a huge nerd about this stuff. I just love hearing it and going over it. But two, we have a bunch of different discussions at this summit, and I think you can bring a bunch of them in here and shown how they all interweave. So we have presentations on story structure, we have presentations on backstory, we have presentations on character, we talked about theme, and I think the way you've encapsulated the idea of turning points really shows how all these different elements work together to communicate essentially something that is change, right?
Yes, transformation, right? I mean, because I think we spend a lot of time plotting, and God knows I need to. But it's not really about the plot. We're reading for character. In really every genre. Yes, plot might matter more in some genres or in some stories, but when we really cheer is the character who it was really hard for. And as opposed to like the guy who, like James Bond movies are fun, but he never really digs deep, as far as I remember. It has been a while since I've seen a James Bond movie, but
he didn't change for about the first 25, but lately he's got a bit of an arc.
There you go. Okay.
He now has a childhood and a couple of other things.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah. So yeah, all right.
Well, Kris, thank you so much for coming in here. This was a fantastic presentation. Where should people go to learn more about you, to learn about your editing and the other teaching? Clearly, you're an incredible craft teacher here. Where can they learn more about working with you?
Well, my website is kriskennedy.net with a K, K-R-I-S. And I also have Romance Writing Lab, which is in the process of launching courses and summits and editing, although that's available now. And I have a newsletter too right now that people can sign up for, and they can do that at the website, at the Romance Writing Lab website. And every couple weeks I send out these kind of tips, like just small, super easy to think about for whatever page of your story you're writing that day, and see if you can apply it. Also, I'm pulling those together. There'll be podcasts soon, and so all that will be on the Romance Writing Lab website.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here today, Kris.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I thought it was great. I really appreciate it.